Welcome back, focused learners, to today's Explainer. We're getting right into the mighty sovereigns of the Ottoman throne, specifically Sultan Murad I. You know, when we look at the Ottoman Empire, it is so easy to just fixate on the legendary founders or those later incredibly famous conquerors. But I was actually fascinated to discover that the true foundational architect of the entire empire was Sultan Murad I. So together, let's explore exactly how he took this burgeoning little state and basically forged it into an unstoppable intercontinental superpower.
Okay, let's dive into this. The sheer scope of his impact is perfectly framed by this really powerful observation from the British historian Edward Gibbon. He said, Osman Ghazi gathered a nation, Orhan Ghazi created a state, but the empire was established by Murad. And honestly, that perfectly captures what we're exploring today. Osman and Orhan were absolutely crucial, of course. I mean, they built the vehicle. But it was Sultan Murad I who actually paved the roads, laid down the infrastructure, and built the engine that allowed that vehicle to just drive right through history for centuries. To really grasp the scale of his success, consider this genuinely staggering number: 500,000. By the end of his 29-year reign, Sultan Murad I left behind 500,000 square kilometers of territory. He literally expanded the lands he inherited from his father 5 times over. And what's most incredible about that massive territorial footprint is that it didn't just fracture and fall apart after his death. No, these lands remained under Ottoman rule for 5 centuries. That kind of lasting power requires some immense structural integrity. It's also really fascinating to see how his own people addressed him, because his titles perfectly capture this sort of dual identity he had. He was known as Khudawand Gar, which translates to chief or master in Persian, really highlighting his role as this supreme administrative statesman. But he was also called Gazi Hunkar, meaning veteran ruler in Turkish, which is a total nod to his relentless, hands-on military leadership. This was a sovereign who was just as comfortable buried in the complex intricacies of state bureaucracy as he was literally leading a cavalry charge on the battlefield. Now, his path to the throne wasn't exactly handed to him peacefully. Because political power was seen as the common property of the dynasty in Old Turkish tradition, his reign kicked off with some dramatic and frankly dangerous internal conflict. His very own brothers, Ibrahim and Halil, actually rebelled against him. So Murad had to ruthlessly suppress these first Shahzadeh revolts, these uprisings by the royal princes, just to secure his throne. This early trial by fire proved right out of the gate that he was willing to do absolutely whatever it took to consolidate power and ensure the stability of his state. Let's move to and see how this builds, because once his throne was actually secure, his momentum into Europe was terrifyingly rapid. Just tracking his expansion here. In 1363, he captures Edirne and brilliantly moves the government headquarters there, settling tens of thousands of Turks into the region. Literally just a year later, in 1364, an allied Christian army is completely destroyed in a night raid that becomes known as the Rout of the Serbs. By 1371, at the Battle of Chermin, the Macedonian gates are basically thrown wide open to the Ottomans. And this relentless push ultimately culminates in the legendary 1389 Battle of Kosovo. He wasn't just raiding Europe, he was structurally anchoring his empire right into it. But here's the thing, this wasn't just about military might. It was brilliant, pragmatic policy. The Balkans at this time were essentially caught between a rock and a hard place. You had the Hungarians actively threatening the local populations with forced Catholicization, but in stark contrast, Sultan Murad offered religious tolerance to the Orthodox Christians. The historical irony here is just fascinating. Orthodox Christians, including the Greek patriarch himself, actually preferred Ottoman rule over the threat of their fellow Christian Hungarians. So Murad won through tolerance just as much as he won through the sword. Of course, the drama wasn't strictly contained to Europe. Back in Anatolia, his own brother-in-law, Ali Bey of the Kardamanids, tried to stab him in the back by invading Ottoman lands while Murad was busy up in the Balkans. I absolutely love this quote because it completely humanizes Murad. He exasperatingly shouted, "Look at what this stupid, cruel man has done. While I have devoted my life day and night to the war in the way of Allah, he is coming and attacking Muslims." It totally transforms Murad from just some distant name in a history book into a living, breathing, frustrated guy dealing with narrow-minded relatives. And needless to say, Murad marched right back and easily dispersed Ali Bey's troops. Dealing with those petty skirmishes in Anatolia while actively conquering the Balkans made Murad realize something absolutely fundamental. An empire just cannot survive on military victories alone. You need a machine that runs itself. And this is where we see his genius pivot from pure military conquest into massive state building. He He realized he needed to lay a 500-year institutional foundation. In fact, if you ever wonder why the Ottomans outlasted all the other Anatolian beyliks, those smaller Turkish principalities, it is precisely because of the administrative reforms we're about to look at. So the crucial point is that a pivotal piece of this institutional puzzle was the centralization of law and education. Back in 1361, he established the office of the Kazasker. And this wasn't just some fancy administrative title, this was essentially the equivalent of a supreme chief justice. The Kazasker was fundamentally responsible for appointing and controlling all the judges, the qadis, across the lands, as well as leading the Islamic scholars. By doing this, Murad permanently centralized the empire's justice system and its education bureaucracy. He literally standardized the law of the land.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how he solved a massive military problem. Temporary, fee-based soldiers simply weren't going to cut it for a growing multi-continent empire. So, the Penjik Law was enacted in 1362. It dictated that 1/5 of war captives, which legally belonged to the state, would be taken and strictly trained as incredibly loyal statesmen or soldiers. This singular stroke of administrative genius formed the permanent paid Kapakulu Corps, which directly laid the foundation for the famous Janissary army. He built a professional standing army literally from the spoils of his conquests.
All of this intense state building and military organizing led right up to the absolute climax of his life. The year is 1389. We are on the plains of Kosovo. The Europeans are understandably terrified of this Ottoman expansion, so they assemble a massive Serbian-Bosnian allied crusader army of 30,000 troops. Murad marches out to meet them with only 20,000 Ottomans. This battle is legendary. It actually featured the first documented Ottoman use of cannons on the battlefield. It was an incredibly brutal, exhausting 8-hour conflict, and it was a fight that would determine the fate of the Balkan nations for centuries to come.
The historical chronicles from the time paint this deeply moving picture of the Sultan the night before that battle. Sitting in his tent, fully aware of the heavy odds and the massive stakes of tomorrow's conflict, he prayed. But he didn't pray for his own survival. He prayed for his armies. He said, "O my Allah, sacrifice me for these Muslims, so long as they are not defeated and destroyed at the hands of the enemy." It's just a deeply somber moment that reveals a sovereign who was ready to give absolutely everything for the state he had built.
And, as history tells us, the Ottomans were indeed victorious that day on the plains of Kosovo. The Serbian Prince Lazar fell, and the Crusader army was completely devastated. But, shockingly, Murad's prayer from the night before was actually answered. Right at the end of the battle, a wounded Serbian knight named Milos Obilic claimed he wanted to meet the Sultan, posing as a defector. When they brought him before Murad, Obilic dramatically lunged and stabbed the 63-year-old sovereign, assassinating him right there on the spot. In a single chaotic moment, the architect of the empire was gone, cementing his status across the Islamic world forever as a martyred sovereign. But here is the true testament to his life's work. Because of the incredible foundations he had built, his sudden death did not break the empire. The enemy couldn't even take advantage of his assassination. His legacy, honestly, just speaks for itself. In 29 years of non-stop military campaigns, he was never once defeated. He enlarged his inherited lands 5 times over. And perhaps most importantly, he's remembered by historians today not just as this fierce conqueror, but as a surprisingly gentle ruler who successfully won the hearts of the Christian populations he absorbed through genuine religious tolerance and brilliant diplomacy. Which really leaves us with a final, profound question to consider today. Could the Ottoman Empire have ever survived as a global superpower for 500 years without the administrative, military, and cultural foundations laid down by its martyred architect, Sultan Murad I? Osman and Orhan may have planted the seed, but it was absolutely Murad who ensured those roots grew deep enough to weather half a millennium of history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, Focus Learners. Stay curious, keep exploring, and I will see you next time as we uncover even more fascinating historical truths together.